Welcome back to Brojo Online. Today I want to talk to you about envy. I had a really interesting call with one of my clients about envy, and we were able to explore the secret value hidden in this really uncomfortable emotion. So, without revealing too many personal details, let me just tell you about my client. So, he's been wanting to do something of a career change for quite some time, but he's scared of the implications. It requires a bit more risk taking. It means the finances would be a little more uncertain, and that people in his industry would judge him for making this kind of controversial move. The other day, he's out at dinner with one of his friends who has made this change, and he felt a lot of envy for this friend. He felt frustrated that his friend was able to do this while he still feels stuck. And so he explored the narrative behind that feeling to see what his envy story was. So when we explored it, he discovered that the story basically said two things about this other guy. One is that he doesn't care what other people think of him, so he's not held back by the fear of social consequences for making this controversial move. And the other is that he's not worried about the future, so therefore any financial risk doesn't hold him back. So my client's story is basically, I can't do it because I care too much what other people think and because I'm too stressed about money in the future. And this friend of his doesn't have these disadvantages, and that's why he's able to do it. So this is envy. Envy is when we look at someone who has what we want, is being who we want to be, doing what we want to do, and we tell ourselves a story about how they have an advantage that allows them to do this thing or be this thing that we don't have, and therefore we cannot also do it. In simple terms, envy is the disadvantaged victim story. It's the he can but I can't story. Now, this is different from other similar positive feelings like admiration, respect, inspiration. If I admire someone, I'm seeing them as further along the path that I'm on. I'm looking ahead of my own future here. I know that I'm going to get there one day myself, and it fills me with joy to see somebody else there, to see that it's proven that it can happen. If that's the way I feel about it, then that's admiration, not envy. Envy, you don't feel like you're going to get to where they're going to get to. Respect is looking across at a peer. So if I respect someone, it's because they're achieving what I'm achieving, that I see them as my equal, and that I totally understand what they've had to go through to achieve it because I've had to go through it too. We are equal in that way. And inspiration is when you see somebody doing something that you didn't think was possible, but now that you see them doing it, it has become possible for you, or you didn't even have the idea, and seeing them doing it arises that new solution in you, and you also believe like I could do that too. So it's not envy if you think I can do it, essentially. Envy is also different from an accurate measurement of limits. That's what it portrays itself as. It portrays itself as like you can't because rational reason, insert rational reason here. But an accurate measure of limits would mean that you've actually come up to a real life wall as you attempted to do the thing. So let's say if I look at the pull up bar at the gym and I say, oh, I don't think I could do 10 pull ups, that's not an accurate measurement of limits. Okay, that's just me imagining hitting a limit. Now, if I'm actually on the pull up bar trying my very best and I get to 9.5, and no matter how much I kick my feet, I can't get my chin above the bar, then my limit is 10 pull ups. All right, I've verified it, I've validated it, I've tried my best, and I've actually hit the wall in real life. So it's very important to distinguish the difference between envy and a measurement of limit. And the real measurement is, have you actually gone and tried your best and hit a limit from the external world, or have you just limited yourself in your mind? Another way to say it is you only actually find your real limits when you're making progress without stopping. Any other limits is something that you just made up. Envy often happens prior to starting. So we most often feel envious when we're not even on the path at all. Now, it does sometimes happen when we're already on the path and we've hit like a wall, or we feel that we've hit a wall. We can have envy there. But even then, if you look at it carefully, you'll see that you've stopped somewhere. You could keep going, but it would require something of you that you're not willing to give at this time. So the truth about envy is that some part of us, some subconscious part of us, knows we could actually do it. We at least could be doing more than what we're doing. We could be somewhere on the pathway to what we're envying, but we don't want to for some reason. Usually something to do with the effort or the emotional kind of resistance that we'd face in doing it. So the envy story is like a justification that rationalizes not moving forward to hide the fact that we actually could move forward. It's just we don't want to pay the price of moving forward. We don't want to admit that to ourselves because then we don't really have an excuse not to take action, not to stay familiar, stay in the comfort zone. Whereas the I can't because I'm disadvantaged story sounds like a very rational excuse to bow out of the race. At a deeper level, the way I interpret envy is that we see other people living by our core values, our principles, better than we are, and we want an excuse to not have to do it ourselves. See, if I see somebody achieving something, I don't actually even know why they're doing it. They might be doing it for totally toxic reasons. But what I see in them is that if I were to do that, it would require me to live by certain principles and certain values that I have. And I'm terrified of doing that. There's something about that. I really don't want to pay whatever the cost is for that integrity. But I don't want to tell myself I just don't want to have integrity because I can't sell that story to myself very well. I won't be able to sleep knowing that I could do it and just simply haven't. So in order for me to get a good night's sleep, I have to come up with a story that says, hey, you're off the hook because you can't do it. This is why talking about envy is one of my core value questions. I got 4 questions I ask people to help them elicit their core values. And I ask, what do you envy about people and why? And this is to elicit the story they tell themselves about the values they should be living by, but for whatever reason are resistant to making those moves. So some common examples of values that we're not living by that create the envy story. One would be responsibility. So often when we're looking at somebody else's success and saying, I wish I could, but I can't because blah, 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 insert bullshit story. We've seen someone who's decided to let go of being a victim and take responsibility for their decisions, their behavior, their results. And that responsibility is just a burden we don't want to bear. We like to be the victim. We like to be the person who can say, I can't. And if we were to say, I can, then we got all this extra work we have to do because now we've admitted our actual duties and obligation. I think equally as common in this envy scenario is the value of bravery or courage. So what we're really seeing is somebody overcoming our fears. We're seeing somebody who's willing to get uncomfortable in a way that we're not willing to. It's not that we can't, we're just not willing to. If, for example, you see someone going out and getting rejected, it's not that they have some sort of skill that you don't have. It's just the beating heart and the closed throat and the heat in the back of the neck sensation of being afraid is something they're willing to increase, whereas you're not, which means you're not living by the value of bravery where they are. Now, it might even be that they're not scared at all doing this thing, but you would be, and that's what you're projecting onto them. Determination is another common value. So we see someone persist at something beyond the point where we would give up. So we've maybe been conditioned to believe that things have to go well straight away, or otherwise it's not worth doing, or that we measure the wrong kind of data. So we measure how well we're doing at guitar by how much people like our music, something like that. And so we run out of determination. We give up way earlier in the process than a determined person would. But we don't want to admit to ourselves, like, I should just keep doing what I'm doing and endure the discomfort of that. So we tell ourselves a story like, there's no point in me continuing. It would have only gone even worse. Even when we see progress, when we are determined. Honesty is another big one. We tell ourselves a lot of story about somebody has an advantage or they're being tricky or whatever it is, but they're just willing to be more honest than we are. And so they have deeper connections and their business goes better and their career goes better and people like them more and so on. And we don't want to admit that that's what they're doing because we're very uncomfortable revealing who we are. We've got the imposter syndrome and so on. Curiosity can be another one, which is we're seeing somebody who's willing to be humble about their beliefs. We're seeing somebody who's willing to be open to change, somebody who's willing to adapt. And we've found ourselves settled into an identity and a belief system that we're comfortable with, and we wouldn't want that challenged. I think this actually happens quite a lot. I think envy is often the death of curiosity. We don't want to find out how they did it. We don't actually ask. Have you noticed that? We don't go there with a notebook and some humility and say, "Teach me, master." We're just like, "Oh, he just did it because X, Y, and Z. I'm not even going to validate it." And leadership. Quite often, we're just seeing somebody who's willing to go first, break the mold, get in trouble, run against the grain, do something that nobody else has done and see what happens rather than waiting for a green light from somebody else, waiting for somebody else to do it first. And we tell ourselves that they're whatever, they've got some gene that we don't have, or they got some skill set that we don't have. But the truth is, they're just willing to get it wrong. And we could get it wrong too if we were willing to. So, what this envy story really does is it creates a delay, an action delay. And this is fear's greatest weapon. I've talked about this in other content. That ultimately, all the tricks that fear plays on us comes down to one key tactic: put it off. Don't do it today. Because you got to understand, it's the best tactic. If fear can always make you think, don't act now, do it later, then for the rest of your life, it can stop you from doing something. It's like somebody promising to pay you tomorrow. They can just keep making that same promise and you never get paid, right? And this is what fear quite often does. And it quite often does this with an envy story. It'll say, yeah, you will do it, but not yet, because first you need to gain that advantage that they have. And it's often something you have to wait for. You don't just go and make it happen. You know, you have to wait till you're this, then you can do it. You have to wait until that opportunity comes up. And not yet because, you know, they are obviously this and you're not that yet. That's what the envy story is often doing. It's kind of simultaneously stopping you and promising you. It's stopping you from doing it now and promising you'll do it later, hinting that you'll do it later. And of course, sometimes the envy story says you'll never do it because you can't. But when you keep hitting an envy story because you really do want to move forward on this thing and it's bothering you that you don't, then it will start chucking promises in. Just wait until this happens. You'll need a bit more money before you can do that. You'll need to wait till you move to another city. You know, that's why they're able to do it. You need to wait until you become them and then you can do it. And obviously, there's actually no clear pathway to getting to that thing that allows you to do it. You know, it's just another kick it down the road, not today. So it either creates this image of him like not yet, or it just creates an image of impossible. It'll take an advantage the other person has or a trait they have or whatever, and it'll try to choose one that you definitely can't have or looks like you'll never have. For example, if you struggle with socializing, it says you're not tall enough. Well, you're never going to be able to grow height, are you? So it's chosen something that you can never catch up to, so give up, right? Or it might say something, you didn't come from a rich family. Well, you can't go back and come from a rich family, can you? You can't correct that. So you go, all right, I guess I'm out of the race then. So it tries to pick a certain trait that you can't do anything about. And if it can't convince you of that, it'll pick a trait that you can't have right now, but maybe later, in order to keep that sort of carrot dangling in front of you, that promise that something one day will happen so that you don't actually do anything today. I think a lot of this is based on conditioning. Maybe you've heard this story before or seen it in real life, but the elephants in Thailand. I actually feel bad about riding them now because I know it does damage to them, but I did it once. Okay. I went to Thailand and I rode them. And I was quite struck by how docile and tame the elephants were. I mean, to see something the size of a building being bossed around by this little Thai guy, you know, it was interesting to watch. All he had was like a stick and he controlled an elephant. And it kind of blew my mind. Like, why does the elephant put up with this? He could just chuck the guy fucking 100 meters, stomp him to death. Why is he tolerating this treatment from us? And at first I thought, oh, maybe it's they do it for food or whatever. But I'm like, no, elephants have no problem finding food. What is going on? Now I found out, as probably everybody else already knew, these guys grow up with these elephants. They've had these elephants since they were babies. They've been in charge of conditioning these elephants from before the elephant could even think. So what I'm seeing is a grown-up child, essentially. They view these little Thai people as their parents. And one of the things that really emphasizes this is how they can restrain an elephant by just tying them to like a twig with a piece of string. What they'd like tie up, I'd expect if you're going to like restrain an elephant, you need this heavy duty chain around all four legs or something. But no, they don't need to. They'll just put a little rope around his neck, tie that rope to like a pole made out of wood, and that elephant will wait there. That elephant will starve to death there. It won't even try to escape. And it makes no sense because even if you're not an elephant expert, it's very clear the elephant has the strength to just break the string and break anything else it needs to break. I mean, you probably couldn't even hold it down with chains, but it just sits there like it's totally restrained. And I realized because once upon a time, that elephant was so small that that was an effective restraint, that it couldn't break the string or the piece of wood. And that happened long enough for the elephant to form a belief that this piece of string is stronger than me. That if I'm tied up with this piece of string, there's no point in struggling against it because I can't break it. And if nothing happens to break that belief in the elephant's mind, it will forever be a slave to that piece of string. According to the elephant, that piece of string is like graphite steel, and there's no point. You're only going to hurt yourself struggling against it. It doesn't really understand that as it grew up, it got stronger. And I think this happens to a lot of us that eventually leads to us creating envy stories. As you'll notice that the theme of your stories, maybe it's like about wealth or about good looks or whatever, is something that you grew up with, that a lot of people told you this kind of story as you grew up, that this was the flavor of envy around you when you were a kid. For example, if you grew up in a poor family, you would have often probably heard a lot of negative stuff about rich people. And it would have been stuff around how they have an unfair advantage and so on and so forth. So you would have grown up thinking that if someone is rich, that they're probably a bad person and deceptive and unethical, and or they were like something was handed to them that you just don't have access to. And that would have started before you even had a chance to go and investigate the truth for yourself. So, especially because people who suffer with struggling to succeed in some area are often friends with and surrounded by other people who also suffer in that area. And so they just swap stories and pat each other on the back and console each other with this justification for why you all suck at something. You know, we've all got this, we've all been through this. We're all limited by our peer group culture. And sometimes, of course, this goes as far as being like national culture. You know, you get this in New Zealand, for example, with tall poppy syndrome, like the belief that it's somehow arrogant to succeed, that kind of envy belief that you wouldn't want to try and succeed because you have to be an arrogant prick who hurts other people to do it. It permeates throughout the entire culture. So you try to do well at anything, and people start giving you shit as if you've harmed somebody. So you can grow up in this like environment without even being aware that that's not the only environment available. And I can see this like in Czech Republic culture where I now live, is the way people feel about doing well financially. There's this idea of kind of like snobbery, this idea that you've done something unethical, and so on and so forth. Now, none of these poor people go out to verify if that's actually true. They don't go to find out. They just have a repulsion, and it leads them to like be sort of too modest and humble about accepting money. They'll do a lot of stuff for free when they should be paid. They'll deliberately take on jobs that their peers would approve of, but that don't pay well, and so on. So before you look at your own envy stories, have a look at your conditioning. Take a moment to think back to something that you would have thought of as normal. It would have been just the beliefs everyone seemed to have around you. But take another look with a critical eye. When you're envious of someone, do you start telling yourself a story about how they're different or advantaged or bad in some way that sounds like stories you heard when you were younger? Some common ones, money is a very common one, that if you struggled financially, you'll have often been raised around people who also struggled financially. I mean, we tend to live in class societies, don't we? So we're surrounded by sort of equal paychecks relatively. And therefore, stories about people who did better financially, what were those stories? Were they admiration, inspiration stories, or were they more like envy, hate stories? Odds are, if you're still struggling financially, it wasn't admiration, respect type stories, was it? It wasn't like you could do that too if you just learn what they did. It's more like you don't want to be like them or whatever. You can't be like them. And that's why you're still struggling now, because you keep telling yourself that story. Sometimes it comes down to physical traits, even race. You know, I have a few friends and clients that think they can't succeed because they're not white, as if being white gives you an advantage that nobody else could ever have, right? Because they were raised in that environment. White guys are bad. White guys are harmful. White guys have an advantage. You're disadvantaged. You're a minority. You know, that kind of language will give the impression that like I'm actually held back physically in some way, that there is a real limit. I don't even need to go and try and find that limit. I'm so sure it exists. There's no point in exploring. And it can be other physical traits. Like I said, quite often guys who struggle with women think that height's a really big important factor, or penis size, or something they don't have. right? Even it can come down to sort of skill sets. Somebody's good at talking, you think you got to be like that. Again, you got to go back to childhood. Where did you learn this story? Sometimes it won't even be like at home, but maybe in school. Like a lot of the limiting beliefs I developed around dating and women and attraction, I developed through my peer group in high school. I was actually relatively pure prior to that. I was just an eager young boy, and once I hit puberty, I'm like, all right, let's check out this girl situation. I was untainted at that point, relatively. I still had some sort of stuff, where I've been affected by feminism and thought guys are kind of bad and sex is dirty or whatever. But once I really started struggling with women in early puberty years, I was surrounded often by guys who also did, and we started swapping stories, explaining to ourselves why the guys who did succeed with women are the ones who treated them badly, these jerks, and we didn't want to be like that, or they were tall and good looking, or they were in the cool group, or whatever. We started trying to tell ourselves stories to make sense of why other people were succeeding and we weren't. And then we started to believe the stories as facts. And it's the same stories we'd tell ourselves later in our 20s. And it can be location. You might be told that you have to be from a certain place or of a certain beginning position. It can be timing. People tell you that like it's luck. That's another one that I developed a lot, is that people who do well have some sort of luck or timing that's beyond their control, and you just have to wait for it to happen. It's not something that you can manufacture or initiate yourself. This kind of idea that they just got lucky. I mean, you think about sex, for example. A lot of guys back in my day, we used to refer to sex as getting lucky, sort of implying that this is something that drops out of the sky. You just got to be available and hope to catch it when it's your turn. The idea that you could actually go and create relationships with women intentionally. No, you sit and wait for them to come to you. I think that's why a lot of people buy lottery tickets. They believe the story that finances is something to do with luck, or why a lot of people would go to university thoughtlessly. Have you noticed that? I did that. A lot of people do that. They sort of in university, like, how did I get here and why am I here? I guess it's just because I got to. This underlying belief that you need an education, you need qualification, you need validation from society before you'll get paid, and that becomes part of your envy story. So somebody's doing well, you're like, oh, they got a better degree than me, or they're more qualified than me, or they're more intelligent than me, and you'll just blatantly ignore the people who are unqualified and less intelligent than you that are doing better than you. You'll have another story for them. They're unethical, they're deceitful, they got lucky, right? You'll just ignore the facts that you don't actually need any of these advantages. So my one was often about luck. It was often about skills. It was often about genetics. Those were the kind of envy points I often brought up in my narratives. So my big struggle when I was younger was with women and dating, attraction, that whole field. That was where like the biggest pain point in my life was, and the least success was happening. And so I had to come up with a lot of envy stories in order to get to sleep at night, because I didn't really want to admit that I'm the problem. And because if I had to admit that, I'd be lost because I didn't know what I was doing wrong. So, like all humans, I reached out to seek some other explanation that I could make my peace with, not some it's all your fault and there's nothing you can figure out explanation. So, when I saw guys who were doing well with women, I would tell myself stories about them. Sometimes the story was a negative one, like they're a jerk, they're an asshole, they're a psychopath, and they trick women into liking them, they seduce them. And that story helped because I was like, well, I don't want to be like that. So I'm actually noble for struggling with women. It shows that I'm a good guy, because only a good guy would struggle with women because he doesn't use these tricks. Right. So I tell myself a story that I'm actually, the guys I envy are actually bad people. Or I might tell myself, if I couldn't, bring myself to believe they were bad people, like one of my best friends was really good with women. I knew he wasn't a bad guy and that he didn't treat them badly or anything. I'd tell myself a different advantage story. Like he had an older brother who taught him how, right? Or he's just naturally good with words, or he's genetically good looking. And because all of these things were technically true, it was a very easy story to believe. I'm like, well, not only are those things true, I don't have those things, and that's also true. So therefore, I'm off the hook. I missed out on the lottery of what's needed to do well with women. And I'd see these same envy stories carry over when I started my business. I'd see people who looked pretty much like me doing better, generally speaking, in business, And I couldn't understand this. I'm trying my best. They're trying their best. They're getting way better results than I am. So I'd start telling myself a story that, like, they got their timing right? Or they were lucky enough to choose a niche that was trending, or they started with a bigger audience that I couldn't hope to, or they grew up in a family of entrepreneurs and they got lots of advice. And sometimes these will be things I completely made up without investigating. Sometimes they'll be true facts about the person. But again, it was the same type of envy story. Like, they had this advantage that I didn't have. Therefore, what can I do about it? The idea that I might have just not been living by my core values, and that had I lived by my core values, I would see movement in these areas, that just never actually occurred to me because the envy story had already taken up the space explaining what was happening. There was really no room for anybody else to offer an explanation until much later in my life. So hopefully you're already thinking about your own envy stories and starting to wiggle them a little bit, like, is there room for another explanation? Just because I've believed the same story I've been telling myself for many, many years, does that actually make it a legitimate story? Or am I just legitimizing it through repetition? Because to beat this, and you can beat this, to actually fucking succeed, you first have to admit that the story about the barrier is the actual barrier. The barrier is not real. The disadvantage is not what stops you. The story that the disadvantage stops you is what stops you. Okay, it's believing that story. The elephant isn't actually held back by the piece of string. He's held back by the story in his little elephant brain about how the piece of string can't be broken. Right? When we look from the outside at the elephant, we're like, dude, just walk away, because we don't see the string the same way he does. Right? But we know the string doesn't hold him back. Well, whatever it is that you're struggling with, I guarantee you, from a successful person's point of view, and whatever that area is, when he looks at you and hears your story about why you can't, to him it looks like a piece of string. He won't buy it for a fucking second. And you'll know this too, because you've done this. You've succeeded at something, looked at somebody else who says, I can't do it, and just thought to yourself, yeah, you can. You're bullshitting yourself. Right? Like, what? That doesn't even make sense. That's not a real barrier. Because you know what the real barriers are because you've overcome them. So you just got to accept and try to get that in your head, trying to have empathy for it, that if somebody successful was looking at you, they would not believe your story. That to them, your envy, this conclusion you've come to about why you can't, would sound like total crap to them. All right. And you want to try and see what it is that they can see. Because once you see that, you'll be able to move past this. So if you actually do want to succeed, you're going to have to let go to the warm bathing bath of envy that you've been enjoying. Okay. Because you enjoy it, like, oh, I'm so much better than them because I'm disadvantaged. I'm the victim hero. If you'd actually put aside that noble story about how you've been disadvantaged, that you're the underdog who has to struggle more than other people, and that's therefore you're a good person, to put that aside and go, actually, I'm just bitching out. I'm just believing a story that's not true, making it an excuse, and then patting myself on the back for it. I don't want to be that guy. Right? I'd rather be the guy who does well at this thing than the guy who fucking mocks the dude who does well at this thing. So the string is not what restrains you. It's the story about the string, or more accurately, believing the story about the string. Because even the story doesn't stop you. You have to believe it's true. Which brings us to the 3 questions. Let's get practical now. These are the 3 questions you can ask yourself to detach yourself from envy and figure out how to actually succeed in this area, whatever the fucking thing is, right? Is it true? Does it matter? Can I take a baby step? Those are the 3 questions. Let's break them down. Question, is it true? So first off, the advantage you've told yourself that the other person has, do they actually have that advantage? Does the advantage even exist? Where's the evidence for this advantage? Where's the undeniable proof that they have it and you don't? We go back to my client. His story was that his friend doesn't care what other people think and isn't worried about the future. And so I asked him, is that true? Have you verified that? If I go speak to your friend right now, will he confirm that that's true? Are you sure? And he said, no, he's not sure. In fact, he's pretty sure it's not true. Because one of the things he said is that, his friend isn't worried about the future. And in the same paragraph, he talked about how stressed out his friend was. And I pointed out to him, like, well, how can somebody who doesn't worry about the future also be stressed? Isn't that the very definition of stress? To be worried about something that has not yet happened? To wish for something that isn't? How can that not be about the future? I mean, if you're cool with the way things are going, you aren't stressed, right? If you look forward into the future and think that's going to be brilliant, I'm very certain my future is looking bright, are you going to be stressed? No, of course not. That would be a cure to stress, wouldn't it? So he thinks his friend doesn't care about the future, and that's why he's advantaged, and yet he's stressed. So there's actually counter evidence to the idea that he has this advantage of not worrying about the future. My client never validated his conclusions. He never went up to the guy and said, is this true about you? He never went and tested it in any sort of scientific way, because the envy story says you don't even need to check. You don't even need to try. So this is the first question. Sometimes it is true that the person has an advantage, but come back and go, do I know that for sure? I mean, is it just other envious people have told me it's true? Or that I've noticed something that I thought was evidence of it, but if you put me in a courtroom, I wouldn't be able to prove my case? Like, are you sure? There's some times where it is true. Like, let's say, for example, I think a guy who's doing really well with women is tall. I can say, yeah, he is tall. Look, he's 6'5". That's tall. So sometimes it's true, but first figure out if it is or not before you leap ahead to the next stage of going, well, that's the reason they do it. And you even got to be careful when a successful person tells you about their advantages or their success factors. There's a great book called The Formula by Albert something, Lasko something. I can't pronounce his name, Polish professor. And he studied success, basically, he just studied quantitative success in people. And one of the things that he found is when you ask a successful person, why are you successful? Like, how did you make this happen? And then you measure what they actually did and what clearly quantitatively gave them success, you'll find that they have two different answers. So, for example, classic one in business is somebody says, I just hustled real hard and, I just was willing to work harder than the other guy. And then you look at what they actually did and you found out that they had some key connections in their network that they exploited to quickly grow their audience. And that was all they needed to do. So the grind and the hustle wasn't actually all that helpful. It was a waste of time. But they've told themselves a story that was the thing, because that makes them sound noble. It makes them sound independent, makes them sound like they did it of their own free will and they weren't just lucky or advantaged. So quite often a successful person won't say, I'm just lucky, or it's just this tiny thing that anyone could do. I'm not special. They'll say, I'm special and I did it this way and that's what sets me apart, because they want to believe that. So even when a successful person tells you, this is what I did, you got to ask yourself, is that true? Did they actually do that? Is that what actually helped? We've got to find out before we jump to conclusions. One way to ask yourself this is, could someone else, a detached observer, find an exception to this rule? Let's say you come and tell me, Mr. Skeptical Coach, of this advantage that other people have over you. Are you telling me I couldn't find an exception to prove you wrong? Let's say you tell me that only tall guys can find a great partner. You think I wouldn't be able to go out and find a short guy with an awesome partner? You sure about that? Whatever advantage it is you say that other people definitely have, ask yourself, would I not be able to challenge that? Let's say you say, other people aren't worried what people think of them. You think if I go and investigate those other people that I'm going to come to that conclusion? If I went and did a deep dive psychological assessment of those people, I'd come back saying, yeah, none of them care what other people think of them. No. See, I told myself that guys who were good with women, successful in love, you might say, knew something that I didn't. They had some key piece of information. I was always hunting for that key piece of information. I can't take any further action with women until I find this key piece of information, right? Classic fucking envy carrot story, right? When I actually took the time to go and listen to them talking to women, they never said anything I couldn't think of saying. They never said some magic code or some unknown word that wasn't in my vocabulary. They never talked about anything that I wouldn't naturally talk about. Now, it's not to say that they didn't have some skills socially or some courage or something that I was yet to develop, sure. But there was nothing magic happening there. There was nothing new. I wasn't actually missing any information. I had enough information to go on to get started. And some of them were actually saying relatively mundane, boring, stupid shit that I could probably, I'd be more entertaining to talk to, frankly. And so the idea that it's true that they have this extra information, this extra advantage, I couldn't find evidence to prove that. And what I noticed is when I was talking to a girl that I was not attracted to, that sometimes they would be very attracted to me. So the idea that I couldn't be attractive to a girl because I was missing information, there was a lot of counter evidence to that. So the idea, is it true? The answer was no. So it brings us to the next question, regardless of whether it's true or not. The next question is, does it actually fucking matter? Let's say you either can't find out whether or not the thing's true, or it is true, right? So you either can't validate your theory about this advantage, or they genuinely do have this advantage. That's fine that they have this advantage, because the next question, does it matter, is even more important. Even if it's true, is this a valid factor in success? Now, not just is it helpful, because that's different. For example, playing basketball, being tall is helpful, but not everyone who's good at basketball is tall. For tall to be necessary, you wouldn't have any exceptions. There'd be no short basketball players. Okay. So it's the same with wealth. Coming from a rich family, certainly helpful. Statistically, that's clearly proven. Is everyone who does well with money coming from rich families? No. There are some people who come from quite impoverished backgrounds. There are people who refugeed to a country with nothing but the clothes on their back and made something of themselves. So there are exceptions that prove that it's not a rule. I used to tell myself with my business that must be some sort of intelligence thing, that entrepreneurs are really intelligent. And yes, being intelligent is helpful to an extent, but there's actually, and this has been proven as far as I understand with studies, too much intelligence is unhelpful. Okay, so sometimes you might think something's an advantage, and it's actually a restriction. So you might look at somebody running a business, it's because they're so smart. Well, actually, being smart's probably slowed them down. There's a certain level of mid-range intelligence that's perfect for entrepreneurship. You're sort of dumb enough to just move forward with whatever simple idea comes to your head, but also smart enough to not make stupid fucking mistakes. It's a beautiful range to be in. You get too smart, you start to overthink everything and start to believe that what you know is what's best for other people, and then you're not humble enough to actually build your business, and you're not brave enough to take actions. It's correlation does not equal causation. Okay, just because a lot of people who succeeded have a trait isn't the same thing as that trait is necessary. It may not even be relevant. Being good looking helps socially. Absolutely, it does. But people who are objectively ugly also can do well. And it may even be an advantage. People don't see you coming when you look average, right? If you want to go and approach a person on the street, if you come in looking really good looking, they might actually be more suspicious of you. If you come in looking average and then you blow them away with bravery, actually you get extra points for that, right? Because there's like a cognitive dissonance. How does this plain looking dude being so fucking bold actually makes you more attractive? Whereas the good looking person comes and does it, you're, well, yeah, of course. I mean, look at you. Nobody's ever said no to you in your life. So you got to apply Occam's razor here. What's the simplest explanation? How can you cut all the fat from explaining why this happens? Is there anything you can cut without affecting the outcome completely? In other words, can it be done without this? Whatever your advantages you say the other person has, say they're braver than you, or they're wiser than you, or they're taller than you, or they're richer than you. Is it possible to do it without that? Can you find any exceptions? Can you find a lot of exceptions? I asked my client, could you still make moves in this career change when you are scared of what other people think and worried about your future finances? Like, are those necessary things that have to be different for you to make this move? And of course, straight away, the answer just came to him, no, those are not requirements. That's not a cause and effect relationship. It'd be easier if I felt that way. Sure. We can admit that. We don't have to deny the truth here. We're not lying to ourselves. It'd be much easier to play basketball if you're 7 foot tall. Sure. We can admit that. But does that mean being 5 foot tall stops you from playing basketball? No. Just means you got to work on your dribbling or something, right? And your 3 pointers. The mind lies to you. It says this advantage, not only is it true, but it's necessary. And therefore, you must wait until this advantage occurs to you before you can make a move. And that's the lie. But you can admit, yes, that advantage is helpful. It does help to be tall and good looking and pretty much anything, right? It does help if you want to start a business that you already have a massive professional network of supportive people, right? It does help that if you want to get in good shape, that you have the genetics of an athlete. Sure, that's helpful. No one's saying it's not, but is it necessary? Right? Just because somebody else got to start at a 3 out of 10, does that mean you can't start at a 1 out of 10 and catch up? Which brings us to the last question. Once you've answered those first two, is can I take a baby step? Let's say you don't have the advantage, the advantage is true, you don't have it, and it looks really important. Might not be cause and effect, but it looks pretty close. Can you still start anyway without it? Maybe it is relevant to have a talent for good conversation and to be really good looking in order to do well in dating. Maybe that's true. Does that mean you can't go and talk to a girl right now? Is that what that means? Does it mean you can't ever even try to improve your social situation? No, of course not. Because the envy story, even if it's all true, it really falls apart when you say, like, am I at the absolute limit of actions that I'm capable of taking on a long enough timeline where I've got as long as needed to move forward in this thing? Am I really at the limit of my skill set? Is there really nothing I can do? Because the envy story is trying to convince you that there's nothing you can do so that you won't observe the fact that there's always something you can do. Okay, it's trying to put you off even starting by saying that even if you can see a starting action, there's no point in starting because you're going to hit a wall eventually anyway. It's trying to convince you that you've already hit the wall when you haven't even fucking started. You don't even know if the wall is going to exist. Look at my client. Could he make a move in the direction of this new career change while still being worried about what other people think and still worrying about his future and still being attached to his so called safe job? Of course he could. He didn't even need to tell anybody. He could do it in secret. He could do it anonymously. He could do it through a friend. I mean, some small moves available to him. So why doesn't he do that before he concludes the story and wraps it up in a nice little bow and says that his friend has something he doesn't? Sure, you might be accurate in saying that full success in this thing cannot happen right now with some sort of magic wand maneuver, but find me a situation where you can't even take a tiny move in the right direction. Because I've been coaching for well over a decade now, and I promise you, you will not be able to come up with an example that I'll believe. Too many times have I seen this disproved. I have never, in my career as a coach and a probation officer before that, seen an envy story that actually aligned with full reality. I've seen people hit real limits in life. I don't believe that anything's possible. I do believe there is such things as impossible. But an envy story happens well before impossible's been actually validated and hit. The envy story is based on imagined impossible, not real impossible. And the thing is, when somebody goes towards what they want to go for and they hit impossible, they're often quite close to ideal anyway. Let's say, for example, you think it's impossible to be a successful musician because nobody ever makes it in art, and the people who do, they're natural savants, or they did something unethical, or they got lucky, right? You got that big envy story about being a musician. Well, what will probably happen if you actually try to make a career from music is you'll get close. You might not and probably won't become a rock star. They're not going to have you on the MTV Awards or whatever. But getting to the point where you play in a couple of bands that you really enjoy, and then you make your money from being a session musician and writing jingles for ads and providing background sound for movies, that is probably about where you'll end up if you try your best. So the idea that you're going to get nowhere near it, that's the lie. And you might still get to Rockstar, but you might not actually want to get to Rockstar. Maybe you want to be a journeyman actor. Maybe you want to, there's the journeyman idea that I've talked about in other content, which is you can become someone who's just pretty good at something. And that's actually totally satisfying. And going further would actually ruin it. It's like a journeyman actor, those people in the movies who you always recognize their face and they're in everything. They're never the main character, they never win an award, but they're in everything. They're always playing like the same person. They're always like the bad cop, or the evil henchman or something. And you couldn't fucking think of their name if you had a gun to your head, but you know their face. And they're never in the newspapers with some scandal, and they're still married to the same person. They have a healthy family, and they're like maybe a millionaire, but not a multi-millionaire, or maybe they make a few $100,000 a year or something. Like, isn't that ideal? Like, you don't have to be Brad Pitt to do acting as a career. let's say you want to get into dating and attraction. No, you might not end up being the next fucking Hugh Hefner, right? Surrounded by playmate models and having nothing but threesomes every night. Are you sure you even want that? How about just getting to a point where you find a partner who you get along with really well and you raise a family with them? Is that not better than sitting around alone, whinging that other people are doing better with women? Quite often, the envy story will actually ask too much of you in order to put you off. Will say, you'll never be the best at that. So don't be the best at it then. Be in the 70th percentile and still have an awesome fucking life. Who cares? Find successful people, the ones who do well where you want to do well. Instead of envying them from a distance and telling yourself a fucking story about what they did, go talk to them. At least find out, is it true and is it necessary? Right? At least get those first couple of questions answered. Doesn't matter. Let's say you've got a friend and he's tall and good looking and suave and really good at talking and funny and witty and has a doesn't give a fuck attitude and just does really well in dating, while you're sitting there struggling, holding on to your beer or whatever. Go ask him, go like, dude, look, hat in hand, I suck with women, you're awesome with them. I have a big story about how you're good looking and tall and stuff, but you tell me, why do you do so well where I struggle? And I'll tell you from my experience, because I've done this, they have surprising answers, and they will not agree with you that it's because they're tall and good looking. Okay, they know there's something else they're doing. I'm not going to share it on this particular podcast. I've talked about it enough in other material, but they're doing something you could do too. And sure, being tall and good looking gives them an advantage, but not as much of an advantage as you think. People aren't as picky about their stuff as you believe they are if you have other things that you bring to the equation. So go tell your envy story to the people you envy and see how they react. Find out the truth behind the scenes. Sometimes it will be true that they have an advantage, but again, does it matter? Can you still take a baby step? So on. What you don't do is tell your story to other people who struggle in the same area, because they're just going to validate it, right? They have the same story. That's why they're still struggling. Right? I firmly believe that if you're unsuccessful in something that you want to be successful in, it is self-sabotage. Whatever story you tell yourself about the world holding you back or you being disadvantaged, I promise you from the bottom of my heart, I will within 10 minutes find you 100 exceptions of people just like you who did it anyway, even if the advantage or disadvantage is real. So don't talk about them, because they're just going to agree with your story and they're going to add their own stories and make this even worse. You want to surround yourself by the people who actually don't have that story or got past it. And that's pretty much the ultimate, is to find the person who's not only successful in this thing, but they were once like you. Okay, a mentor or a coach or someone who was in your position and somehow got out of it. They clicked, they challenged the story, they found the truth, they moved forward. That's the person you want to be talking to. That's the person who's got the secret sauce. Don't guess what they did. Go and fucking ask them and talk to them about it. Ask for their guidance. Get them to critique what you're doing, give you feedback. I promise you there will be some new information in there for you that you did not see coming or don't want to admit is true. So use envy to prompt yourself to take action. That's the real value of envy. Prove yourself wrong. You envy someone, you're jealous of their success. Go and find the truth instead of sitting there and bathing in your self-pity. Okay, because as wonderful as that feels, you and I both know that gets old real fucking quick, doesn't it? Comes a point where you're like, okay, sitting around envying other people has really just lost its flavor. I'm chewing old gum now. I don't want to do this anymore. I'd rather actually be one of the people who everyone else is telling stories about. Hopefully that was helpful. I'll see you guys next time.